So I guess now we'll turn to DC and the efforts in 2011 to resist. What is that story? It ended up obviously not being successful, but the lessons learned, the important takeaways from that fight, and really how it played out.
Yeah, absolutely. So Uber entered DC like it did many cities in late 2011, and it abided by this idea of move quickly and break things, which for Uber meant don't actually follow the law. So it enters illegally in many places.
No
And it,
other tech platform has ever done that, right? I mean, I've just completely memory hold Theranos, but anyway, sorry, continue.
how about railroads? I mean, we can gold mine. Yeah.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah, it's a long history of an attitude coming out of Silicon Valley that it's better to ask permission or ask forgiveness rather than
Hmm.
permission. So when Uber arrived, there was sort of a lone, in our telling, there's a lone regulator who was really worried about its implications for the city. His name was Ron Linton. He was a lifelong regulator, and he set up and starred in his own sting to show the city, actually, we have a huge problem here and we need to figure out what to do about Uber. When he had a driver fined and the car impounded from this Uber drive that he had, sort of videotaped with journalists, he was right to bring it to the fore. What I don't think he imagined happening was sort of a denouncement of regulation as a public good, right? DC was struggling with this question. What should we do about Uber? Should we turn it to actually follow the law, change Uber? Should we change the law to follow Uber? And then there was this other view, which was whatever you do, please don't make the city out to look like anti-tech dinosaurs.
Mm.
And so the debates about Uber were always sort of wrapped up in these questions about urban economic competitiveness and the city's desire to make it look like an inclusive Silicon Valley. And by inclusive, I mean racially diverse.
How does that branding begin to happen? Because I mean, the taxi model, right? I mean, I'll take not the United States, New York, for example, because we've had actions by cab drivers, including horrifically a suicide in front of City Hall with a sign taped to him basically saying, I blame the government for ruining my livelihood because in New York City, you have to purchase medallions. It's an investment in your own kind of
Yes.
personal business for a taxi cab. And when Uber just came in and took over, immediately tens of thousands of New Yorkers. I don't have the exact figures, Bradley. Maybe you can look up the how many taxi drivers there are in New York City. But their livelihood went away. And was that something similar that was happening in DC? Where was was there resistance? Were they being listened to?
Yeah. So, and remember that one suicide was one of at least 8 in a year, right? What we were seeing, right, was workers that were saddled with debt. They were underwater with investment they had made. And I think the parallels to the subprime mortgage crisis were huge in terms of who was getting protected and who wasn't, right? But there were also parallels at that time, right, to thinking about Indian farmers, right, that were
Mm.
committing suicide because their livelihoods had suddenly shifted amongst sort of economic forces and they had looked to the government and the government was looking out the window. So in DC, we had a little bit of a different situation. Certainly many workers we talked to were saddled with debt as Uber arrived, but it was less intense as that in New York because we did not have the medallion system. And we also had a system where we had about 116 different companies were operating. It wasn't sort of the big cartel model.
Right.
Um, which has its pluses and minuses. That the real downside meant that DC taxi workers weren't able to mount a really meaningful challenge to this new intruder.
And how I don't know the racial complexion of DC taxi drivers, but it seems like odd to deploy a racial equity argument in favor of Uber. I don't want to go as far as to say it's deeply cynical, but maybe I will, because it's totally a fig leaf for just cheaper labor practices.
Absolutely. So that was one of the hardest things to figure out, given DC's really radical Black history and sort of strong record of trying to imagine a really full kind of racial justice that included economic justice, it felt so gross to watch Uber as a company come in and tell people, we will solve racial justice when we think of you as a consumer. And by you, I mean sort of Black residents, but not thinking about the fact that it was a Black majority immigrant workforce that it was displacing, right? So Uber on one hand is saying, we're going to address racial justice as long as you think of racial justice just in terms of the consumer, right? Your ability to get a taxi. Because certainly there were complaints that taxis were racist, that they weren't willing to pick up, Black individuals. There was a lot of concern because they were a majority Ethiopian and Eritrean community against the African American customers. So there were real issues there, right? We don't want to discount that question of hailing while Black. And yet the argument that Uber made and the vision that it and Spike Lee and others have sort of celebrated involves such a really narrow reading of what racial justice looks like. And it doesn't take into consideration this idea of economic justice and workers being people who also need racial justice.
It is deliberately narrow to just focus on the, one of the more acute experiences that non-white people face when trying to hail a taxi, right? Like that's just such a front-facing example of the deep structural inequalities that lead to systemic racism. And they're using that to disempower a population of workers who were in a more stable position. So it's a really, I would say, thwarting and not terribly honest way to go about business, but it seems like a lot of cities bought it.
Yeah, they did buy it, right? And they bought it because they didn't actually have solutions themselves, right? And there was also the issue of the disability rights community, right? Saying on one hand, taxis are not addressing our needs, right? The city is not addressing our needs. And so maybe Uber will come in and help disabled folks get access to better mobility.
Right.
Now, we haven't found that to be the case, but certainly who doesn't want to hope for a better solution?
Absolutely. And can you talk a bit about how when Uber was trying to disrupt the market, they made their prices cheaper so that people began to use Uber, and that must have been an incredible shock to cab and taxi drivers throughout many cities.
It was, absolutely. It was also a shock to policymakers. They didn't know what to do with it, right? Wait, is this a gift? Are they giving us something? What do they want in return, right? But what we soon found out, what they wanted in return was something that they sort of unveiled in DC, sort of this playbook of clicktivism, right? Where suddenly the company was able to text every single one of its users and say, please let the council, the DC council, our governing body, know that you absolutely do not want the price of your cab, your Uber, to go up.
Right.
And that was a shocking moment. And oh my God, they used the phrase Operation Rolling Thunder, which of course refers to a US military bombing campaign of Vietnam.
Yeah. Yikes.
But that's how they described that was their code name for their first DC battle, using this collectivism model.
I mean, it's a way to imbue yourself with some sense of heroism when you're really just a tech person trying to make a lot of money. Interesting window into the psychology there. So in 2012, DC legislators, I should say, introduced the Uber Amendment. What happened there? Why did it fail? What was that period of time like?
Yeah, so there was a moment in 2012 where DC legislators were concerned with questions about disability rights, and they were floating this question of maybe we should require these new chauffeur services, Uber, Lyft, Sidecar, to uphold the American Disabilities Act and uphold the requirements of all other transportation companies. Now that failed. There was also an attempt in that Uber amendment to require a price floor to try to protect taxi services, to say maybe Uber is a luxury service and we should make sure that it's, at a higher rate. We should also make sure that it's paying a tax to the city that is equal without a chauffeur services. It should share its data so we understand its effects, right? It's really hard for government to regulate something it can't see, which is the case of many of these companies. But all those proposals, right, they flopped.
Yeah.
And thanks to Operation Rolling Thunder.
Well, last question. You did spend time with drivers and got some insights into their experience. What would you like our audience to know about what it's like to be a driver for Uber in DC?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we spent about 5 years tracking 40 drivers as they moved on and off the apps. And I think one of the things we learned, especially during the COVID pandemic, is the extent to which Uber is a solution for them, right? One driver, Diana, said to us, Uber helps me at my time of need. And I think what I would want listeners, of the Majority Report to think about with these stories about Uber drivers is what is it that we need to do so that Uber no longer is a solution for these workers, let alone the customers? What kind of a city do we need to build, or what kind of expectations do we need to have so that Uber isn't the pernicious solution that it is?
Right. I mean, it starts with making people's lives more secure, and so they don't have to, on their off time, try to make money by driving for Uber. I mean, it all starts with these propositions that we're seeing undercutting benefits for gig workers, I would say. We have a long way to go, and unfortunately Uber has a really big head start in what they tried to do.
No, and I think the important thing is these Uber drivers, right? They're in some ways a symptom of the failings of our labor markets, but they're also a harbinger or warning of what we're about to, face.
Absolutely. Dr. Katie J. Wells, the book is Disrupting D.C, The Rise of Uber and the Fall of the City. Really appreciate your time today. We'll put a link to your book that you co-wrote along with Kafuyato and Declan Cullen. I apologize. And we'll put a link to that in the description wherever you're listening to or watching this, and at majority.fm. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, Emma.